everyone. Maria Young here, welcoming you from SHEP Earthaware and Green Spaces for Health, Cork Healthy Cities, Cork Chamber, the Environmental Research Institute and Cork Environmental Forum. We're delighted to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Colin Sage, and look forward to hearing his thoughts on the question, can Cork feed itself? The local project we're highlighting today is related, and it's the Cork Food Policy Council's coordinator of community food growing gardens in Cork. Finola McCarthy, horticulturalist, will talk about food growing developments across the city. Speaking about gardens, we're installing a garden in Clashtooth Park this Saturday coming at 9 a.m. All are welcome to help us out. That's Clashtooth Park in Toker. Our moderator today is Denise Cahill from Cork Healthy Cities. Denise will formally introduce our guest speaker, who will give his presentation lasting about 40 minutes. The session will then open up to questions from the audience. As always, these will be facilitated through the chat box. And just so you're aware, we're recording this session for the archives, and you can access it through Cork Healthy Cities website. This is the last Greening Our City series of 2021, and hopefully we'll be up and running again in the new year. We'll keep you updated about what's happening. And by the way, if any of you have ideas for topics or speakers for 2022, please let us know by entering them into the chat box or email us at a later date. Thanks to all of you out there who supported this series since the beginning. It's been a great success and we really enjoyed producing it. Thanks to all our partners, particularly Vicky O'Connor from Cork Chamber for all her technical and other inputs, and to Denise Cahill for doing such a terrific job moderating the series. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy today's talks, and I hand you over now to Finola McCarthy.
Okay, hi, my name is Finola McCarthy. It's great to be here to introduce this topic. I suppose first to contextualize my perspective on the question, can Cork feed itself, is just from a community food grower, from a practitioner perspective. So that's what I try to show in the first few minutes and give that context from on the ground. So my own background at the moment, I'm with Cork Food Policy Council in community food growing, but I've been involved in different projects in Cork City for the past few years, whether it's as a teacher and then as a volunteer in other projects. So what I've tried to do today is sort of trace that a little bit, that change in my perspective that's happened from a few years ago. And I suppose the start of the Cork Food Policy Council, and that pushed people to get going and to start on the ground up to now. I will say straight off, I won't be answering the question, can Cork feed itself? It's a massive question, multi-layered. It's fantastic. So what I've tried to do is, what I ended up with is loads of questions as a practitioner, which I have for you for discussion at the end. So what I'm going to do is trace sort of that community perspective on it, what we've done, what we are doing, where the growth is, what people are interested in, and then open it up after that for discussion after Colin then speaks as well. So that's my plan to introduce it. So Cork Food Policy Council this year has become very active in supporting community food growing initiatives. So not just food as in eating, waste, other things like that, but the actual growing of foods has become much more prevalent in the actions of Cork Food Policy Council. There's been a huge number of new initiatives started this year with the support of Cork Food Policy Council. And it's important to say it's a supporting role. It's a networking, it's a getting people to connect up, the right people to connect up. That's the role in it, is that supportive role. And I just chose one of them. The most recent one that we're involved in at the moment, looking at how we're developing a model of best practice. So I suppose myself and Maria more so is involved in this work throughout the year. But that learning that's happened from these new initiatives and them being set up is hugely rich in Cork. We've had a variety of different types, whether they're residents, whether they're local associations, schools, different ones. So one of them is the International Solidarity Garden, which is quite an interesting example. And it's a very good example of what we've learned, is that all that is actually needed on the ground in Cork is someone to connect everybody up. that everybody is there. The resources are there, the skills are there, the knowledge is there, the people who want to grow. To some extent, the most difficult can be to get the land, but it has been very successful in that. We play a minimal role in it. There's a wide variety of multiple stakeholders already existing. They just don't know how to connect up with each other. So this project, this garden, is with families in direct provision to grow their own food, to grow communally their own food. So it's not allotments or anything like that. It is a mini urban farm idea, really. So the knowledge that was there on Saturday, we met with the families. There's 3 people who are horticulturalists living in direct provision. 1 is farming background and 2 horticulturalists. So the knowledge is there. They don't need me as a horticulturalist at all to talk to them about soil, to talk to them about what they want to grow, not needed in any way, shape or form. And it's been fantastic really to see that we're linking up with a gardening course. We've done a lot of work with that as well this year between permaculture course, Kinsale, the sustainable horticulture students, and the LTI in Ardfoyle, that ability to bring those extra bodies. Also with different businesses. So in this one, we have a company who's involved and is looking at supporting it as well, and workers can come on days of workshops. So that multiple stakeholders, we're getting very good at that model of best practice, really, that everything is there. It's just a connecting role with them. The interest is the same, and anyone I've talked to, and I've been doing this for the past year, I've never had anybody tell me they want to use chemicals in their food production. It's at all. So that's what that point I have there about climate change, food security, sustainable development. Anyone who wants to grow food, who I've been talking to in Cork, these are issues that are concerning them. These are things that are driving them to do it. So there's no convincing to be done in Cork anymore. There's no getting the message out or the conversations to be had. I found that on the ground. People are very keen and they're very aware. And also just from it, I've seen that Cork has many unique selling points. We have the Cork Food Policy Council. We have sustainable horticulture students who are designing permaculture designs. You know, the knowledge and the skills and everything is here, just to take more action now. So that's the first thing. So can Cork feed itself? So from a community grower, my background is mostly looking at small scale, working one-to-one relationally with people or small groups on learning to grow food for their own well-being. That's my background. So I don't think strategically about Cork City at all in my practice over the years. I would have done as a volunteer, as a passionate citizen who loves Cork and wants to see it greening and coming more alive. I would have done that in my volunteer work. For me, I think about people, land, and system. As a grower, that's what I think about. I need the people to do the work. There's a physical aspect to growing food. There's no 2 ways about it. The land to grow it on. And I'm going to leave out of this discussion. I don't have time for hydroponics and aquaponics and stuff. I'm just talking about land, just traditional ways of growing traditional crops. And then the system that needs to happen within it, it has to be connected up to the people who are going to eat it, to where you're going to get the seed stock from, all of that, so that there's a system in place. So anytime I've been involved in any project, that's what we're looking at, is that system as well. And just beyond, and you know that the intersectionality of it in economic development, environment, health issues, and we're becoming more aware of that in the past few years. And it's across those, that growing of food and food production links across those. So my changing perspective, I suppose one of the things has been the idea we have a food capital of Ireland. Cork is the food capital of Ireland, but for me, that's very much an artisan food capital. Whereas for me, I would like to think of it as the food capital of growing traditional veg and traditional crops that grow in our climate. So that would be one change in perspective I've taken, and I would challenge us all to maybe take that change on that title that we're quite proud of, rightly so, but to maybe alter it a little bit. And then from community garden to try and thinking bigger. We do community garden in Cork very well, but to think bigger into urban farm. So even the change in language to farm, not garden, is an important step in food production, I think, for us. An urban food growing system. Sorry, let's just move. Sorry, now Cork food growing strategy, so an overall strategy, and then food citizenship as a right for people to grow their own food, to have access to their local food. So that's the broader thinking that has happened to me in the past few years in this work, that I'm going to trace a little bit with you now. So one of the things that had a big impact on us a few years ago, and many of you were probably involved in it and remember, would have been Todmorden in West Yorkshire. It had that incredible edible. It had a huge impact on people who were involved in this stuff, and we were passionate and we wanted to get out in the city streets and just start growing veg and plant them everywhere. And it was a huge inspiration for that, and it was fantastic. So if you're not familiar with it, at the moment they're up to more than 70 different public spaces growing food. It's completely volunteers. Nobody is paid full time. So it's 280 volunteer network, and it's radical community work. So I'm from a more traditional community development work, but this is radical community work. Which is probably why I did it in voluntarily in my free time. Financially self-sustaining, and have a policy of not applying for public funding. And they're still maintaining that. Now from that, and we had a lot of box schemes and different things with Greening Cork's historic spine, different things came out of that, and there was a great push and drive for it. But I think interesting learning for me as a practitioner, what I learned from that project and the influence it had on us is they have an idea of innovative collective agriculture production experience. And I'm going to draw you to the language there again. It's not putting a bit of kale in a box somewhere. It's collective agriculture. And that change in language in Cork, I think, needs to happen, and how we're thinking about community growing is collective agriculture. That step up, that upscaling even in our language, if we're thinking about it for the whole city. They also, what's quite interesting, and I think a lot of times we maybe don't do this as well, is their aim is to confront hunger, malnutrition, pollution, and climate change. So at the forefront of it isn't community. There's very clear aims on it, and out of those, this action has helped them to bloom the city and to encourage civic solidarity. So those other more human aspects come out of it. Those benefits to the people in the community come out of more of a focus on growing the food, how you're going to grow it in relation to climate change and systems, and what methods you're using. So that's quite interesting. And then as well, what I like about their aim, which I don't think we've done as much yet, is support and promote local farmers. I have it highlighted there, that link, that idea of how are we in our initiative supporting and promoting local farmers. And then as well, one of their great strengths is an integral pedagogical network. So that learning and education is part of it too, which we haven't pushed as far as that in Cork. So there's still stuff to learn from their experience. And we certainly learned from Moore's an awful lot about the need for sustainable design in these initiatives, what's going to happen long term. The involvement came out of it of maybe getting businesses more involved in these activities because they're there on the streets, and this, can maintain a lot of the work that goes. So that we have learned huge amount as practitioners, this need to have multiple stakeholders. That volunteers going out on their own isn't enough. These stakeholders around in the space, in the area, in the place to support it and be part of it too. So there was huge learning for us for practice from that. So then our strengths in Cork City, I suppose one thing to mention is with the boundary extension, we're at a time of change, and there's huge scope for that change. And what do we want the expanded city to look like in relation to food? We have a high level of expertise, skill and knowledge between the colleges, the students, everybody that's here, food growers already here who've been growing in community growing initiatives, community workers, an awful lot of community workers and mental health workers have done social and therapeutic horticulture and have horticulture projects as part of their services. Horticulture has popped up and growing food has popped up in schools, hospitals, everywhere on all the grounds all over the city. That has happened already in a small scale. So there's a huge amount of knowledge and skill and will for this stuff already in the population. We've well-established groups and networks, as you can see from even the series of talks between, I can't even mention them all, but SHEP, Earthware, Cork Environmental Forum, Cork Nature Network, loads of different organisations well-established and already working with the same visions, the same values, the same shared views already. So that work's already done. With land then, like the places you would advise someone to start would be schools and places like that. We're already doing that. So many primary schools have small school gardens for growing some veg and some fruit. They'll have wormeries and composters and things like that. The connected producers, we have a good markets already in the city with producers coming in from rural Cork in to sell. And then innovative urban solutions, not so much, but I would argue maybe we don't need to look at them, but we do have one rooftop farm that we can learn from. So it's not like we need someone to go out and do it from scratch. It's already been done. We did that first test run on it. So I have questions for the discussion, basically from where I am now in my work, I suppose, the past year, especially. So I have some questions that I think even I would like to hear some people's suggestions and answers after Colin gives his talk on it, because these are questions that as I suppose, a community grower with a focus on people first, would like to think more strategically about. So should food production be a key area for local government? And I'm putting in food production here, growing of plants, growing of crops. That's what I'm talking about. That's my background. That's my area. It's what I know. Is a municipal farm possible? Now, I know across Europe, there are lots of examples of them. They're usually linked to schools to supply food for school canteens or kindergartens and stuff like that when they work, and they work especially well, whereas we have a different system without the school canteens here. But still, is there a possibility for a municipal farm to lead the way, best practice in food production? So to move away from the small pockets of community gardens, because we have those and we do them well. Is there a way to have a central municipal farm on a larger scale with an example of it and with a much higher impact? Are farmers in the conversation? Are we designing to support and promote? And then can we have a strategy for land availability for lease for small scale growers? And any of the growers I've spoken to, this would be one of the most pressing concerns for them, that there are people who do want to grow, but they don't have the access to the land. You know, past students from different courses, people who are keen themselves to grow, who would like to lease, maybe even with 3 people together to lease a portion of ground and produce food themselves. But can we have a strategy for that rather than just leaving it as it doesn't seem to work and it's not really there? That would be the most pressing question I'm getting from growers I've spoken to. And then as well, just on a larger scale, should we join the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact? Is one that I would like to raise, I suppose. Bigger, that's come up as well. What organizations is Cork involved in that we can link in and learn from best practice that in cities who are already moving ahead with this? So to summarize my change in perspective, trying to think about how we can scale up, because I come from working in trying to get people to grow a bit of veg in like a small box in their window boxes, working with small groups. So for me to think this, I think was a good practice, because I think there's a lot of people like me in Cork who have a huge passion for it, a drive for it, an understanding of it and a need for it, but don't understand how we can possibly have a bigger impact across the city. So one thing for changing perspective for me has been to move from individual community initiatives to a citywide food growing strategy and system. The moment we're very good at the pockets of it, and Cork Food Policy Council does a great role in that, but can we have a wider perspective on it, especially with the expansion of the city and a new city, if you like, that we have now? Community and commercial growers, we're not different people at all. A lot of people growing in allotments and growing and doing bits out their gardens, they're doing that because they're afraid to take the leap to rent, and they don't know how to access land to rent a space to actually become commercial growers and operate some sort of small market growing operation themselves. We're not very different, and I think that needs to be understood as well. Like, I'm very much a community grower, but I worry about production and yield and quality. We have a nice time, it's for well-being, it's for health, it's for being outside, but I want to make the most out of the space that's growing. I want to grow things that don't need to be watered, traditional vegetables that grow outside, easily low maintenance. So we're not that different in our concerns or our passions, it's just a different scale that we do it on. Then to urban food production, the human community benefits will come, but the food production won't happen on a large scale unless by design. And that's something I've learned as a practitioner. My background is social and therapeutic horticulture, and I'm very strong, and I have seen the benefits to people to being outside working in horticulture. That happens, whether they're growing ornamental things or food or anything like that, that will happen for them. But food production won't happen unless it's by design. To grow for yields, to grow crops that you know will grow in this way at this time, high yield, how long can it has shelf life, does it have, that sort of thing, that happens by design. And I think a shift needs to come a little bit in the way we're looking at our projects, that the people benefits will come, but a bit more focus on actual food production, that it's not a bad thing. We can still be taking care of our soil using no dig methods, all of those things, and be feeding ourselves too. And then clear and concrete goals for your local food system as it impacts the design of initiatives. And I think that needs to be something that needs to be a little bit stronger. Is it for people or is it to produce food? What's the goal of it? And whittle it down, because it's different in how you design it. And the outcomes are very different then. And certainly if you're talking about feeding more, producing more food, whether we're even just looking at the idea of a municipal farm and trying to feed, I don't know, a certain amount of school children or whatever, you design for yield and the other stuff comes. So we need to know those ideas, because you all know if you're in a community garden and it isn't so much designed for food growing, but it's designed for people's benefits, health benefits, which is great, then the production isn't there and you're not going to have as high yields. So that would be my change in perspective, I suppose, over the past 7 years, and my attempt, where I only think I give you questions rather than answers, to answer that question. But I would like to, and I'll just go back to those questions again, because I'd be interested for a discussion at the end of this and to hear other people's opinions on these things, and to discuss them with you at the end, basically see if we can pull them apart. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thanks, Finola. That was wonderful. If anybody has any immediate questions for Finola, please pose them in the chat box. Finola, can I just ask you, in terms of the municipal farm vision, can you just tell me what that is, what it would look like, and in Cork?
Sure. So I suppose the ones that I've looked at, because urban farming is something that I'm quite interested in, and the ones that I've looked at have worked better in a system where there's school lunch, schools have canteens. Because most of them in Europe that they work that way, and it's a fantastic system, then they're producing the food locally that goes into the school canteen to feed the children. And it's changed, and there's been huge success. There's one in France and stuff that I can put in the chat box. The change in eating habits of families since that's happened. It's had this knock-on effect completely then in how people are cooking more, cooking healthier foods. It's not part of the curriculum because the curriculum is standardized nationally. So instead, they're reliant on the teachers getting involved and volunteering and making it a part of their teaching week. So there's an education aspect as well to teach children about farming, about food security, where your food is coming from, and then they're actually eating it as well. And then that impact going back home to the families. So it's not in the idea that we can put a farm in the city and it's going to feed everybody. It's more about picking a population group that maybe we could have the biggest impact on. And certainly with children and changing habits in that sense, that's one to look at. I think that could be really useful in Cork. I mean, UCC do have their own one to the canteen. They've been doing that for a few years now to produce it. So it's happening already. Again, it's just about looking at where we could have the most impact. And I think school children, if there was a way for us to access and they be the ones who are eating the food, could be great. But that's just my idea. I'd be open to other people's.
Brilliant. And Paul is just asking, have you had any successful cases of this yet in Cork, or do you know of any good positive examples maybe of this kind of way of working?
You mean connecting up like niche, like would be one example on a smaller scale that's been in Cork for 20 years doing it. So we already have that example of bringing in the education, the health, the cooking, the eating of it, and the growing of the food in the one area, and the impact of that. So that it's just about upscaling that. So we do all of this stuff in small scale. And what I suppose I'm interested in is maybe something a bit of a bigger project now, especially that we have the expansion of the city, to look at it in that way. But niche would be the one to look at as best practice in that. And you're just talking about upscaling it.
Fantastic. That's great, Finola. Thank you. We'll move on and we can come back to Finola in our final discussion again. So if you've any questions, just pose them in the chat box. I'm now very happy to introduce you to Dr. Colin Sage. Colin is a retired senior lecturer from the Department of Geography at University College Cork, and he now works as an independent scholar based in Portugal. Colin continues to develop his research interests in food systems, environmental policy, and civic initiatives for social change. He's an author of a variety of books on the environment and food, journal articles, and indeed contributing book chapters. He's an honorary visiting professor at the Food Studies program at the American University of Rome, as well as the University of Gastronomic Sciences near Turin in Italy. We can fully testify that as an academic, Colin has strong commitment to public engagement. Colin co-founded and served as chair of our own Cork Food Policy Council from 2013 to 2019, and has very clearly demonstrated his commitment to developing transdisciplinary conversations around ways of addressing contemporary environmental challenges. Colin, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
Okay, thank you, Denise, for that introduction, and thank you, Finola, for what was a really remarkably comprehensive answer to the question. A question, I have to say, which has been leaving me wide awake at night, wondering how on earth it was going to be responded to. The question, can Cork feed itself, wasn't of my design, but actually, as I've dug into it, I've realized that this is a question which actually rewards the more that one thinks about that topic. So, so what I want to do is something that is completely at the other end of the scale from what Finola has done. And our talks in that respect are quite complementary, I hope, because in thinking about this question, can Cork feed itself? I suppose I want to say why this is an important question. Above all, it's a moment, I think, not just to ask rhetorically, you know, is it possible to plough up Fitzgerald's Park and plant it to spuds and, you know, feed us all? This is not the solution. The question is to ask some fairly profound questions about how we're going forward, to recognize where we are at this very moment, and then to design an effective response to that question, I suppose. So I think it's absolutely appropriate at this moment to remind ourselves that we're in a climate emergency. And this climate emergency is one which is something which is going to shape really not only our futures, those of us who are here, but those of our children and our grandchildren and possibly all future generations. And the thing is that this isn't just an issue that, you know, we can deal with theoretically. The climate emergency is really going to challenge and indeed will threaten our food supply and food security going forward over the next 30 years. Inshallah, I should still be here in 30 years, but we'll see. But the thing is that the question around food is something that we've tended to disregard in many ways, and one of the reasons for that will become clear in a moment. The current arrangement for the food system, and I have to say I'm just finishing a book at the moment on a research agenda on food systems, so I've got my head into this stuff quite a lot. And it's failing us on multiple fronts, not only in relation to climate, as we'll see in a moment, but also it's not doing what it should be doing, which is deliver nutritional security. So what we have is a legacy of very poor dietary health and highly inequitable access. And when I say inequitable, I don't just mean people in parts of the south of the majority world are not getting enough to eat. That's certainly the case that 800 million people are incredibly food insecure and suffering from chronic hunger. And those numbers are rising. For the first time in some years, those numbers are rising, not just because of COVID, although that's exacerbated the situation, but also, of course, because of changing weather patterns and so on. But that issue of inequitable access is also occurring closer to home. And again, that has been severely exacerbated by issues around COVID and unemployment and all of those kind of things. But that reveals something about how people get access to food or fail to get sufficient access to food. And that's a failure really of our public system as much as it is a failure of the food system as it's developed. Now, in some ways, we want to bring this back to Cork ultimately, but we have to do that via the nation state, because after all, that's where most of the very important policy framings are made in relation to how the food system and health system and educational system, energy system, transport system, how those are all ultimately arranged. And of course, you won't be surprised to learn that food crosses across all of those different policy briefs. But actually, one of the failings that we've had here in Ireland is the effective failing to address food and food policy, to build an effective food policy framework. And that's not the same as boosting agri-export earnings. And somehow agriculture has become regarded as something like something which is regarded as synonymous with food, and it's not. We have an agricultural strategy, we have a new agricultural strategy, which we'll say a few things about in a moment, but we don't have any kind of effective food policy framework. And that's something that we also need to address. Ultimately, and I'm going to start, as I often do, with the biggest picture, is to try and understand just why this question is important. Why the question, can Cork feed itself? This is not something to be answered at a Cork level. It has to be addressed in the context of what's going on at a global scale. And I offer this perspective simply because, of course, we're aware we're down here. And clearly we're concerned with our own individual and family health, and also the wider health of the community, public health. Epidemiology has probably never had a moment in the sun quite as it's enjoying at the moment. And we realize just how vital this work is for understanding how to keep ourselves safe. But of course, the issue is, why are we having to deal with epidemiologists on mainstream evening news? And that's because, of course, unless there are still some people who think that the COVID-19 virus may well have emerged from a Wuhan laboratory, the rest of us are of the view that it's likely to have come as a zoonotic spillover. That in fact, because of activities of venturing deeper and deeper into habitats that probably were better off being left alone in search of plants and animals, of course, including bushmeat, that it's likely to have been that vector that has brought COVID into our lives in such a big way. And so this One Health idea, which has been developed by the World Health Organization, reminds us of how we're situated within this wider world, not only of other humans, but also of animals, both domesticated and also, and when I say domesticated, I mean those either reared in confined animal feeding operations, as well as our domestic pets, but also wild species as well. But of course, that's not all of it. If that were one thing, there's this wider concern around the planetary boundaries of life on Earth. And planetary health is increasingly being shaped and reshaped, of course, by a whole series of factors around climate, which is why I speak of the climate emergency or climate chaos, which is more appropriate than climate change, which sounds far too incremental and gradual for us to deal with. But there are other things happening there as well in terms of biodiversity loss and in terms of the ways that we're interfering with the nitrogen cycle. There are issues around freshwater depletion. There's a whole set of interlocking issues. And because those issues are so interlocking, there's a nexus of these things operating. It's why they're complex. It's why politicians prefer to shun them, because they can't get their heads around the complexity, and it's very difficult to communicate. But actually, if we begin to put that as a backdrop, you begin to realize why the question, can Cork feed itself, becomes increasingly not only important, it becomes necessary, becomes vital to ask this kind of a question in order to secure some kind of a future for ourselves, not in a autarkic way, not in we have to put the boundaries up. I was going to include that map, which I always find amusing, you know, the one that has a map of Ireland that has Cork and not Cork. And clearly we're not going to start putting boundary fences up on the borders with Limerick and Tip. But nevertheless, this idea that we are understanding that we're part of this complex interaction of life. So In order to address this question of can Cork feed itself, I posed a series of intermediate questions. Some I will spend more time on than others. Why should Cork want to feed itself? I mean, this is why, this is really the most fundamental question of all. Why should Cork want to feed itself? I'll ask, and I may even skip this, did Cork ever feed itself? Because I know you know the answer to this. Yes, it did, or at least it did to a great extent. But are there lessons in that might help us as we go forward? How does Cork actually feed itself? Again, we have a pretty good idea of that. And then how would Cork sustainably feed itself? Well, I'm not going to go through a checklist of possible measures that could be used. I mean, Finola's already done that much, much better than I could have done. But you begin to see this is a way we could go forward in thinking about these kind of issues. So let me start by asking the question, why should Cork want to feed itself? And I have to say, the question of climate change, of climate breakdown, of climate emergency is really something of concern, and we should be taking it seriously, because global heating is having marked regional effects in poorer countries and in major cereal producing regions. We're talking about the breadbasket regions of the world, which are producing large volumes of major cereals. 60% of the world's diet, 60% of the world's diet is made up of 3 cereal crops: rice, wheat, and maize. Those 3 account for 60% of our cereal crops. And I have to say that one of the fastest growing crops that are being consumed in Europe at the moment is soybeans. And you say, but I'm not eating more tofu or using more tamari on my foods. No, of course. But those soybeans, that soybean frontier was steadily marching across the Brazilian rainforests. And Sertão is of course feeding the chickens and pigs on which we're feeding. So there are very, very narrow, something like 15 crops are providing something like 90% of our calorie needs worldwide. And I don't think the Irish diet is much different from that in many ways. There's a lot of starchy calories that are being used, as well as meat we'll get on to. So the issue is, if the vulnerabilities of the global food system are mounting, and Ireland imports a great deal of food, which is what we do, as we'll see, what are we to do? Why wouldn't that be a basis for starting to ask questions about, should we be thinking about increasing the volumes of food that we produce at home? Carrie Fowler, who was one of the co-founders of the Svalbard seed vault in the very northern parts of Norway, has said that the coldest growing seasons of the future will be hotter than the hottest of the past. And he asked the question, is agriculture adapted to that? Now, we might think of ourselves as maize farmers in the south, or think of maize farmers or rice growers in Southeast Asia and say, oh goodness, it's going to be difficult for them. But those commodity crops also, feed into the global food system, even if they don't end up on our plates directly. And the issue, of course, is that this adaptation is important as a question, because we're increasingly specialized in producing a few agricultural commodities, and we will ourselves be threatened and challenged by increasing perhaps temperatures, but also, in terms of the climate models, rising levels of rainfall, storms, floods, all sorts of disruptions to established patterns. The global food system is responsible for anywhere, depending upon the methodologies that are used, anywhere between 21 and 37% of greenhouse gas, GHG, greenhouse gas emissions. And so a rough rule of thumb is that we can take 31% as being an average kind of figure for thinking about the global food system. And even if we were to switch off all coal-fired power stations, stop burning all oil and gas from this afternoon, right? Even then, if the food system carried on regardless, that alone would take us through the 1.5 degree centigrade Paris target. You remember the famous Paris target that was agreed in 2015. So the food system alone will take us through that, irrespective of how we go about decarbonizing our transport or energy systems. The science, therefore, is unambiguous, even if the politicians are afraid to listen to it. The science is unambiguous. The food system absolutely has to change. And the question is, how will it do so? because in some ways we're in a situation where, as Margaret Atwood said, it's not just climate change, but everything change. So in some ways, the question is, how are we going to move forward? How are we going to reconfigure our food system? And the reason why this is an important question for ourselves this afternoon here in Cork or wherever we are is that, in fact, unless we reimagine a food system that works for ourselves, I can assure you that Big Food will reimagine that food system for us. And Big Food is moving into has already dominated the food system, as we know, and there are talks about the degree to which Big Food is manipulating and changing the food system in the interest and pursuit of profit, not in the interests, of course, of nutrition and of well-being. And we know that we're going through this, what's being called a global syndemic of malnutrition, obesity, and so on. And we really have to start to take responsibility for reimagining the food system that works for us rather than for big business. And so, where are we today? Where are our politicians? Where our politicians have bought into this food industry, or the agricultural industry here, this Food Vision 2030. It calls itself a world leader in sustainable food systems. I'm afraid this is a rhetorical nonsense. Some of you will be aware I was asked to do a talk as part of the National Dialogue's lead up to the United Nations Food System Summit. And I use the metaphor of Harry Potter's invisible cloak, which is then thrown across sustainability as a way of concealing what's going on underneath. And the fact of the matter is, Irish agriculture cannot at the moment, unfortunately, be regarded as sustainable, however much a spin is put on it by Origin Green. And of course, I understand that it's an important economic sector. It's providing 10% of our export earnings, something like 14 billion euro a year. It's creating 7% of our jobs. Unfortunately, also, it actually does other things as well. So besides this talk about Irish agriculture feeding the world, it's also contributing 37.1% of our national greenhouse gas emissions. This is one of the highest rates across the world. I mean, it's extraordinary for an agricultural sector to produce so much. You compare that with our transport sector, which is less than 18%, our energy sector, which is 15%. The thing is that we understand what we need to do. I mean, it's a challenge talking about public transport. It's a challenge talking about putting people onto bicycles or onto foot instead of in private cars. But at least, there are solutions, public transport and options and so on. Energy, closing down Money Point, putting up a new range of offshore wind farms. We understand that technology. It's much more problematic when you're talking about how do we go about changing Irish agriculture when it's so fixated on producing beef and dairy. And the Environmental Protection Agency has come out with a series of reports that reminds us that agriculture is responsible for a major decline in water quality across the country, 99% of our ammonia emissions, which are very noxious and toxic for air quality, with big impacts upon these creatures. And what it does, I should say, this signboard that you'll see, I was in Rome a couple of weeks ago teaching at the American University, and it's up in Monteverdi, a very nice part of Rome, and this was on a bus shelter, and it's promoting Irish beef. Well, Irish agriculture feeding the world, it's putting Irish beef on the plates of wealthy Romans. It's also, of course, putting infant formula in the bottles of Chinese babies, which is another kind of lucrative market worth about 526 million euro a year. So, trying to disengage from these kind of things is going to be difficult. But actually, if we're talking about trying to really be genuinely sustainable, some of these things simply cannot be squared. We're speaking out two sides of our mouths. So this is a challenge. How do we get through this kind of thing? So Irish exports or food exports of 14 billion, but our food import bill is somewhere around 10 billion euro. So actually the gap, if you like, the net benefit or the trade gap is only positively around 4 billion euro. And the thing is, of course, we have to import mangoes and bananas and coffee and tea. I mean, there's lots of exotic fruits and vegetables that are being kind of air freighted into Ireland, and you know, some of us probably are buying them. But the fact of the matter is, some of those vegetables that are being imported include 62,000 tons of apples per year, 72,000 tons of potatoes, 47,000 tons of onions, 23,000 tons of cabbages, more than 30,000 tons of turnips and carrots. You can tell me that we can't grow those things at home? I mean, it's madness that we're in a system. And of course, you know, economists will tell us, oh, but we're part of an open economy. Well, of course we have to import and export. You know, that's the way the global economy is working. The global economy is taking us to hell in a handcart. We have to start re-establishing some kind of control over what we're importing. By all means, carry on importing things that we can produce at home. But it seems to me somewhat bizarre that we're importing so many potatoes in this way. And then you can see on the other side the exports of meat and so on. I mean, there's no solution in this immediately, but it raises questions, particularly when I saw in the Irish Independent last Saturday an article featuring Fergal up in Galway, saying there's a lack of infrastructural supports for vegetable farmers. I mean, horticulture has been allowed to wither on the vine effectively in Ireland. There's limited effective supports, and numbers of horticulturalists have shrunk, and Finola has been saying how difficult it is for new entrants into the sector, difficulties of getting access to land, and the kind of supports that are there. Now, I'm going to come on to the fact that we have a climate action plan, and I spent part of my weekend, last weekend, reading this climate action plan, so you don't have to. But it actually is, there's some interesting things, but it's disappointing ultimately. It's disappointing if you imagine a climate action plan that's ambitious, that really seeks to really generate some really ambitious targets that we should be reaching. But nevertheless, we have a climate action plan, and it's worth kind of thinking a bit about that. Now, it sets a really, I think, rather modest target for agricultural emissions. These should be reduced by anywhere between 22 and 30% by 2030. Transport's been asked to reduce emissions by 50%, energy by 80%. As I've said, we have some of those technologies in hand that will facilitate that transition. But you can see proportionately, you know, this is quite a significant disparity. And again, probably speaks to the power of the farming lobby in order to keep those as low as possible. 80% of our agricultural emissions are due to our livestock numbers, you know, cattle herds, national herd of 7 million animals, as well as pigs and poultry as well. And what's interesting about the climate action plan is that when it deals with agriculture, it doesn't deal with food directly very much at all. I mean, it's conspicuously missing from the climate action plan actually, but the specific measures that it speaks about in relation to agriculture are measures emphasizing efficiencies. Well, if we only could breed up, you know, with our genetic expertise, livestock that are less flatulent. You know, if we have this so-called miracle that's coming from seaweed as a feed additive, that's going to reduce ruminant gases as well. We're talking about methane here, of course, which is a short-lived greenhouse gas. Methane, I should say, a short-lived greenhouse gas with a lifespan of about 10 years, around which we could achieve some really remarkable improvements in our profile, greenhouse gas emission profile, if we were to seriously engage in reducing methane. But we'll leave that on one side. And then there's, you know, talk about other technical innovations, changing the composition of grass species and swards. I mean, you know, this is one way of going about it, and of course, even that is too much for the farming community. The Irish Farmers Journal commissioned KPMG to produce a report that says a cull of 1.3 million cattle. They were working on the basis of a 30% emission, and that 30% emission reduction of 30% being converted into the loss of animal numbers rather than through efficiencies. They're saying that that would mean the loss of 1.3 million cattle from the herd. And in some ways, that's why we have tractorcades in Dublin, because, you know, the fear of losing, you know, what proportion, how that works out in terms of the viability of dairy and beef herds, I have no idea. But I'm not saying that, you know, farmers are not already on the line in terms of their economics. You know, farming is a risky business, and they carry all the risk and some of the limited less amounts of rewards that are paid to that are paid in the food system. And so thinking about this is really revealing the importance of a just transition. A just transition means we have to find ways of ensuring that farmers pass through this process in a way that enables them to maintain their livelihoods and the integrity of their businesses. Absolutely indispensable point. But, you know, the defensiveness that we've seen amongst the farming community, the hostility and polarization that's happened is not good. And we have to find ways of eliminating that. And that requires leadership. It requires political leadership to say, actually, we have to find ways of effectively getting people around the table to chart a way forward. And the fact that we so often talk about maintaining business as usual in agriculture, which is a focus upon export earnings, of course, fails to address these wider issues around food. And food is missing from this discussion altogether. And so what I would think is that actually, now that we have a climate action plan, as limited as it might be in terms of scope and ambition, it really reveals the importance of building a national food action plan in its own right. And after all, a place that I don't like to compare us to at any time, but even in the UK, they've got themselves a national food plan. Now, of course, Boris Johnson's government are going to ignore the recommendations that were made by Henry Dimbleby in that report, but at least a series of recommendations were put on the table for pretty radical reform of the agricultural and food system in the UK, which is, of course, in an appalling shape anyway. So in some ways, you know, there are things that we can learn about how to go about putting something like that together. You see, food is key in tackling the climate emergency and human well-being. It's not incidental to it. It's not a part. If we're going to be serious about doing anything around the food, around climate, then we have to tackle food. And food is more than agriculture. And just calling it sustainable food or sustainable agriculture as a prefix does not make it so. And in some ways, I suppose the issue is to also acknowledge dietary practices. It's not just putting it all onto farmers at the point of production. It's what we're doing as consumers, as eaters, which actually is driving environmental change. And one of those issues, of course, is rising levels of meat consumption worldwide. I mean, meat consumption in Ireland, as in across the rest of Europe, has flattened or maybe has fallen slightly over the last decade. And certainly in all the rich countries, meat consumption has been leveling out, but it's been growing like mad in China by 6 times over the last 50 years, and in the rest of Asia too, or at least Southeast Asia, obviously not in India. But that represents a big issue. If we're continuously thinking, well, we're exporting into these distant markets, actually what we're doing is exporting into Europe more than into the Far East, but nevertheless, you know, this is an issue. I mean, 75% of all agricultural land across the world is taken up with feeding livestock, either as pasture or as arable land. A third of arable land is dedicated to producing feedstuffs for animals. I mean, this is remarkable. We might say, oh, but all our cattle are fed on grass. That may be the case. I'm not sure it's absolutely 100% true, but nevertheless, you know, I understand the thrust of the argument. But even so, is growing grass the best we can do? And of course, the thing about meat consumption is it's closely linked to escalating rates of chronic non-communicable diseases. Cardiovascular disease, you know, and various cancers are very closely linked to meat consumption. The clinical evidence, you go to the Lancet, go to the British Medical Journal, it's very, very clear. These are very clearly, you know, correlations. So in some ways, the question about sustainable and sustainable food systems has to bring us back to thinking about how are we going to eat in a more sustainable way. and frankly, the only option on the table. And there have been, I suppose, I don't know, maybe 250 scientific journal articles published in the last 5 years that basically say the same thing. We have to eat more plants, we have to eat less meat. It's not to say we all have to become vegans, by no means. We don't have to become vegetarians, but we have to eat less meat and we have to eat more plants. It's the single lesson that's coming through the literature. And the fact of the matter is the co-benefits of going down this particular route will be immeasurable, because Ireland has amongst the highest rates of obesity in the across Europe, and 70% of mortality is linked to non-communicable diseases, most of which are diet related. I mean, there's a smoking element which is non-communicable as well, but smoking levels, smoking cessation has fallen, and therefore it's clear that diet's really critical in this regard. We're not eating in line with what our dietary recommendations. 1% are eating in line with the food pyramid. And I know there are issues around the food pyramid, but at least it gives us an idea of what we should be eating more of and what we should be eating less of. So the question is, do we need more recommendations from a national report that tells us to do this? No, we don't. Actually, we know this. And there was a paper recently published by a colleague in UCC who highlighted how many reports there'd been on obesity, recommendations and reports. We don't need more of that stuff because it's not listened to. People don't hear it. I mean, dietary recommendations aren't very effective tools of changing people's practices, their behaviors. And this is why, what Finola speaks about in relation to working with communities is precisely what gives us strength in Cork. It gives us the basis to say, look, we're not going to start hitting people with saying you have to stop eating your sausages and replace that with tofu burgers. So, I mean, you don't go down that route, but you do begin to start working with people collaboratively in a way of thinking, what are the healthier options that might be available in this place? How can you help cook with people together in kitchens where these new recipes might be developed? So these are not top-down solutions; these are collective things happening from below. Now, did Cork ever feed itself? Well, I don't know whether I'll say anything about this in the interest of time. I should say that on the south side of Cork, what was called Kilreen Downey, Ballyfahan, Toker and Pulladuff. There were extensive market gardens until the 1930s and 40s, until the corporation had to take over that land in order to build houses for people. So in some ways, the question about, being self-provisioned, or at least high levels of vegetables, potatoes, cabbages, all of that stuff was being grown inside the city, the old city limits, let alone the new ones. And of course, we were exporting large volumes of meat in barrels for the Brits, but there was a lot of production going on. And I was also struck, I don't know if any of you have been out recently to Fota House. Last time I was there a couple of years ago, but the frame yards have been restored in Fota House. And, I think they're inspirational. And of course, there's a bit of infrastructure there. It's much more expensive to build a glass house like that than it is to build a polytunnel. But nevertheless, I think there are things from the past that we could learn about and see if they could be adapted and developed as we go forward in terms of new technologies and so on, in growing closer to hand. So I think it gives us a glimpse of shorter supply chains, which are these short food supply chains that could enable us to grow things. And as Finola said, Cork City itself is now somewhat bigger than it once was. So I'm coming to the end. So Denise, so don't worry about timing here. How does Cork actually feed itself? Well, look, how Cork feeds itself. We've got a high level of import dependence with retail food provisioning through dedicated supply chains. Tesco does its thing, Lidl, Aldi does his, SuperValu obviously, is slightly more localized and more regionalized and national. So, I mean, in that respect, we do better, I suppose, in getting more Irish produce through that route, although all the others speak that language increasingly. But we know that their retail supply chains, their logistics are built on bringing stuff in from afar. They do that very well. I mean, they're very sophisticated supply chains, refrigerated from the moment something is picked on the outskirts of Nairobi or in Naivasha, and put into refrigerated trucks, taken to Nairobi airport, and lo and behold, within 2 days, it's in the it's in Wilton's Tesco refrigerated container, green beans or sugar snap peas or whatever they might be. And so, you know, that's how a great deal of our food is being supplied, even if we like to think, well, I'm buying mine from the cold key on a Saturday morning, but the vast majority of people are not doing that. And most of the food retailing, of course, is in the suburbs. And that presents a major planning issue which we normalize. We say, oh, of course, we have to build big roads to allow these articulated trucks to deliver, you know, their deliveries to these large supermarkets, you know, twice a day. And of course, we have to build huge car parks so that, you know, people can go there and drive. You know, in the context of active travel, do these work any longer? I mean, getting to Duns in Bishopstown, for example, you know, on a bicycle as a pedestrian, I mean, there is a bridge there, but my God, it's a disincentive, you know, and we're thinking about improving accessibility for those on lower incomes. It doesn't really work, does it? It doesn't really square very easily. And so I think, I mean, I'm going to come on to planners. I know there's a couple of planners here this afternoon, and food is really a very significant planning issue, and that particularly in relation to the existing food retailing structure. Our food environment also shapes unhealthy choices. It promotes energy-dense, nutrient-poor products. Again, we have powerful players really constantly barraging us with incentives to eat this and eat that and drink this and drink that, you know, on the basis of the profitability of those products, not on their nutritional, you know, benefits. And I think that's really something that we have to start to address. And, you know, here we are in Cork, as well as across the country, 1 in 7 households depending upon charitable food. Again, you know, these big food companies are portraying themselves as you know, as really, you know, incredibly, you know, generous organizations, able to dispose of their surpluses. But of course, it speaks to a food system that is continuously generating structural surpluses that otherwise would go to a big hole in the ground. It's and giving it to, as remarkable as these charities like Vincent de Paul and Simon and others, penny dinners. I mean, I have to acknowledge that these people who are volunteering in these agencies are really remarkable, heroic individuals. I really admit that and recognize that, but they shouldn't exist. And, you know, there is probably going to be inevitably some that will always fall through safety nets. But, you know, if we're talking about a human right to food, a human right to something that if we don't get it, we die, right? If we don't eat on a regular basis, it's not something that's incidental. I mean, I could say I've got a human right to an iPhone, whatever it is, 12 or whatever current model that exists, you know, nonsense. But, you know, human right to food is the difference between life and death. And we've got it into a position where food is a commodity now that can only be bought according to the amount of food that money you have in your pocket, unless charities step in and enable you to survive. Alongside that, of course, quality of food in schools, hospitals, residential institutions, we know is not good. And there are opportunities here for thinking about ways of improving that. And the fact of the matter is, and I say this now because one of the few benefits of living outside Cork these days is that, you know, I do get a chance to get a bit more perspective upon what's going on around Europe. And I have to say there is a remarkable resurgence of what city regions are doing in terms of developing domestic. And when I say city regions, I don't just mean narrowly the boundary of a city, but also the way it's shaped by its hinterland. And many of those cities and their city regions are really developing very sophisticated domestic food strategies to address many of the issues which I've raised. And actually, Cork is incredibly well placed to be able to match those cities, you know, because we've already got heroic individuals in place like Denise and so on, but we've also got, you know, a lot of skills that are now distributed across the city and an awareness of these issues. So really, just to finish off, let me say this. is that food has been a stranger to urban planning, but there's an opportunity for them to become much more closely acquainted. And indeed, I would say that there's a basis for an important partnership, because really this is something which we really have to think a bit about. You know, and there are opportunities for thinking about rezoning lands, making land available for food growing in the city and in the wider city and in the peri-urban areas, thinking about how abandoned buildings might be repurposed for things like internal growing and aquaponic schemes, for example, which is happening in Berlin, and facilitating community initiatives, which Finola so wonderfully spoke about. There's this ongoing issue about no-fry zones, which we've been playing around with, or for a while not playing, but trying to address. And I know there are reluctance on the part of elected representatives to pass any of these bylaws that might actually restrict the creation of new junk food outlets, or should I say fast food, convenience food stores next to schools. But again, in the interest of public health, these are the kinds of measures that are required. It requires leadership, and it requires people to step up to the plate and say, these are something that will really make an effective difference. You've got lessons going on food, on good eating practices inside school. Kids come out of the school, they're confronted by this array of fast food options. We have to change that. We have to find more joined up ways of thinking about it. One issue that I think is an opportunity, it's low-hanging fruit, frankly, is public procurement of food. Now, the Climate Action Plan on page 75, if you want to go and look, says food procurement policies for the public sector, introducing nutritious, locally sourced food. Sorry, I missed a few words out there, but actually it was the most positive thing I found in the Climate Action Plan around food. In other words, this is a green light from government, from this government that says, local authorities and other institutions at local level should now be thinking seriously about sourcing food from within their region. And they can do that through these new procurement rules. And these have opened up. There was once a case when always there was an obligation to take the lowest possible tender price from a bidder for a contract. That's no longer the case. It's now possible to insist upon organic, quality product. I mean, Copenhagen now has converted all its school food 100% organic. There's no reason why in Cork we shouldn't begin to start that process of saying by 2030 we could have 100% organic food in place. Begin by taking those small steps. So public and I don't just mean in the schools, but in hospitals as well. And I know at CUH we had a conversation up there some years ago that there was interest in this, but of course pressure upon public budgets are an issue. One understands that, but nevertheless, there's an opportunity for thinking about really improving the quality of food on the public plate, as we say. The Cork City region now, as Finola reminded us, is bigger than it used to be. So we've got this bigger peri-urban and hinterland. And when we think about the Serengeti plains of North Cork, where we have herds of Holstein Friesians roaming their paddocks, feeding on grass. I mean, there's tremendous potential. The reason that they're there is not just because the grass is rich, it's because the soils are rich. And most of that grass, of course, is grown with the help of enormous quantities of nitrogen fertilizer. Now, that we can't say that we can't reimagine those rich soils being used for growing vegetables as well, even under protected structures, if it was so deemed so necessary. But it might mean that we have to put in place grants in support of those kind of infrastructural improvements. And we're not talking about eliminating all cows off the face of the earth immediately. We're talking about a way of gradually growing a horticultural sector on some of the best land available. And that seems to me to be a basis for arguing for horticultural expansion. I have to say the Climate Action Plan did talk about increasing organic growing by a significant quantity. But again, I don't think we're necessarily well placed there in terms of agricultural supports. I think there's been a failure on the part of our agricultural extension services to provide sufficient supports to that sector. That needs to change, and I'm sure it will. Finally, let me just say intermediaries are important here. It's not just farming, it's absolutely critical. And when I say farming, I mean both in the city, on the edge of the city, and in our, in the Golden Vale and other parts of the county and beyond. I mean, there are lots of possibilities for really intensively cultivating land sustainably, using new methods and so on that can be done. But there is also a really important role for intermediaries to act as food hubs, to act as aggregators, to act as connectors. See, consumers might be, or eaters, food citizens actually is the correct language that Finola used. Food citizens are really the people that want to eat, more local food, better food, but they don't know how to connect with producers. So that's why organizations like Neighbour Food do a really effective job in bringing that. Now, we have to scale those things up, and we have to diversify this retail ecology. We have to move away from thinking everything is to be done through the supermarkets, that it can be done through a variety of intermediaries acting as these aggregators and these hubs by bringing people together. And I think in that respect, Cork is really very well placed. Remember, Cork is the only city in the state that has a food policy council. It has the expertise, it has the profile, it has it's built up trust, I hope, with local agencies, with the city council, with planners. Even though sometimes I don't think we're often on the same page, but we're getting there. And really, Cork is well placed to offer a positive response, I think, in this respect, and to match what's going on across Europe. And in response to Finola's question, should we join the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact? Well, sure. I mean, he says, shrugging his shoulders. Actually, probably a more effective thing to do right now is to sign the Glasgow Declaration for Climate and Food, which came out of COP26, and that's actually probably a more dynamic group of cities and regions that are working to ensure that they work towards a carbon neutral sustainable food system into the future. The Glasgow Declaration, worth looking up, but also thinking about what we actually need to do in Cork now is to build an effective sustainable food strategy for Cork for 2030. To really reimagine what Cork could look like in 2030 and to put in place milestones to work towards that date. And I think we have the capacity and vision and expertise to do that. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Colin. That was wonderful. Take a breath after all of that. Thanks everyone for posting your comments and your questions. Continue to do so. I'll definitely be looking at the Glasgow Declaration, Colin, and thanks a million. And I guess I have just been reflecting on how, this whole issue it's such a complex issue, in terms of, at a local level, how do you impact? And certainly in terms of healthy cities, we'd be thinking like that as well. How do you impact national and global and European policy at a local level? But in some ways, that's the only way to do it, So thanks for your thoughts and reflections and your presentation. Dan Boyle is just saying that the need, because of the climate emergency, for each of us to take a more direct responsibility in the growing of food may appear onerous, but it also offers an opportunity to achieve better cohesion in our communities. And certainly, Finola, I know you were alluding to that. I know Maria Young would allude to that in terms of the work that she's doing in green spaces for health. There's certainly an opportunity here for building community. And so thanks for that comment. Colin, Maureen Lancaster wants to know, does the 31% greenhouse gas include the food grown for livestock? And if we were feeding less livestock, would this number be lower and more people fed directly?
They certainly would be fed directly by producing foodstuffs that are fed directly rather than converted into animal tissue. It's not the arable dimension that contributes so much to the greenhouse gases. It's the animals that are, digesting, ruminating on that material, and then, of course, producing gas, methane, as a byproduct. So that's what's driving that. So if we had fewer animals, then certainly we would begin to lower that 31%. I should say, though, that it's very important to distinguish between regions of the world where animals are really the only way that people can survive from the land. In semi-arid environments, where arable agriculture simply won't cut it. Animals are a good way of converting vegetation into foodstuffs, which is consumed as milk or as blood as well as meat. I mean, many pastoralists don't often eat their animals unless they die naturally. But I mean, that question around it's not about eliminating all animals, and it may not be about eliminating animals from the hilllands, the uplands of our own environments. I mean, some of those may go well into, thinking about how can we start to expand the area of woodland, through reforestation schemes. Perhaps there's still a role for ensuring some of those lands are also grazed by animals, whether sheep or cattle or whatever they might be. So, it's not about eliminating all livestock, but it certainly is a question of saying at the moment, the quantity of animals, the numbers of animals that are, in existence and being supported by 3/4 of our agricultural land simply isn't sustainable.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Maureen, for your other question about the article that Colin referenced, and Hazel for sharing that article if anybody wants to read it there from the Irish Independent. Maria Young is making the statement that community gardens can support and inform nutritional change to plant-based diets in areas they operate in, and that's the building of the community again, I think, and that municipal farm idea that Finola was speaking about. Thomas Reid Muller in the Hollies has given us a whole range of links there if you want to check them out in the chat box. He's talking about Liège in Belgium and the transition movement. And Maria again is referencing again some community gardens that are going on in the south side of the city in the area that Colin spoke about that used to be a market garden. And as Maria said, there's a gathering in Clashdove Park on Saturday morning from 9 to put, I think it's a lot of tons, I think it's 80 tons of soil in place there, which is incredible for planting. And Marion's just saying how Cork had the biggest market exchange, butter exchange, the biggest butter exchange in the world. More links there from Thomas Reid Muller. Thanks for that. Maria Young wants to know, should every city in Ireland have a food policy council? Colin or Finola, either of you want to comment on that?
Well, let me say that it really depends upon circumstances. I mean, the creation of the Cork Food Policy Council in 2013 came out of a project which Finola was talking about in Knocknaheeny, in Niche. And really, it was a kind of gradual process. And, it's sometimes not difficult. You really have to, it's the chemistry of these things that make them work. And I've been engaged in conversations with people in, friends in Galway, and they were quite anxious to sort of create a food policy council. But if the bits don't hang together, it's not going to happen as much as you might want it to. There's a certain chemistry about doing that. So, there have been plenty of examples of food policy councils that have been created in a blaze of glory and then died a death within 18 months. So, the fact that Cork still has one and, is carrying on, all these challenges it faces, lack of financial supports, for example. But, it's because, it fits, it works. And because, of course, the people that are working behind it, we're working with it. So, yes, it would be great if every city had a food policy council, but in practice, actually, they really emerge from circumstances and from, the resources that they have locally.
Thanks, Colin. Maybe one for you, Finola, from Maureen Lancaster. What incentives might be offered to encourage landowners looking for commercial profits to allow urban farming or community gardens to use the land to grow food instead? People are paying a tax on undeveloped land, and we need land for community agriculture at the same time. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one I was actually talking to people about last week and this week, and trying to pull it apart and see what sort of a system could be put in place, because that link needs to be made, all right, between people who want to grow and want to lease land, landowners who have it, and just that bridge between the two. And similar, I mean, not to mention, but like we have already Quilta operating, and I'm not advocating the growing of those trees, but we have a system in place for long leases of land that farmers are familiar with, that we're familiar with in Ireland. Now, in that sense, it means there aren't a lot of times it can be worried about strangers coming on your land, worried about insurance, worried about different things like that. So there's a bit of a cultural shift in it. And just at work, certainly some place of strategy. That's why I was suggesting some sort of strategy in Cork for that, I think is vital, where there is some sort of a system at place that can connect up people who want to grow, want to use the land, and landowners who are happy to rent out a field and see what happens, even between three growers and see. That's lacking at the moment. There's a complete disconnect between those two groups. And I think that's why we don't have more growth in that area, that needs to be put in place systematically. Otherwise you have, like, there's plenty of food producers around who are lucky. They rent a place, the land is there, you know, the landowner doesn't mind that you're putting up a polytunnel, and there's another one, and you're expanding out, but then they're working under very tenuous circumstances where if they're asked to move at any time, they have to move their whole production, their whole job, that the market growing that they're doing. So certainly I think there needs to be a stronger system in place for that, if we're serious about it in Cork, that there is a structure and a link between those two things and a system at place for it.
Thanks, Finola. And James O'Donovan is from Cork Environmental Forum is just saying, just as we have business parks to support new businesses, having food growing parks to support food growing businesses, this could be supported by city planning. And I think that's a point well made. Keelan has put up a link, Keelan Tobin has put up a link there to the green procurement, public procurement criteria for the purchase of food and catering services from the EPA. And Maria Young is just asking, in terms of, you know, the new boundary, what incentives can be provided to engage farmers within the city boundaries to consider changing their farming practices and grow organic vegetables for the city's citizens? Do we need more open food markets? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a follow-on question from the previous one, to look at it that way, because what I was thinking of is more people who want to grow leasing first, but the actual change to have farmers change what they do. I mean, they're predominantly going to be beef, they're going to be cattle background or dairy, do you know? So that's a big change. And again, I don't know if locally, I mean, Colin might be able to answer this better and have examples who've done this locally. I don't know, is that more of a national agro policy change rather than something that can be done in Cork? A cultural shift like that, same way as when we were talking about what Maria said about having community gardens, does impact the habits of food consumption of people in the area and who are involved in it over time. It takes time for that shift to happen. But other than that, I don't know. I think it would be fantastic if we could. I'm thinking it's a positive, but I have no idea whether it would be something we could do at a Cork level or it would be national policy. What do you think, Colin?
Well, you know, I mean, in some ways, there's a series of tiers in here, and in terms of levels. I mean, it's worth noting that the Common Agricultural Policy reform process was agreed and signed off yesterday. And of course, it's deeply disappointing. I mean, we didn't expect much more, but the agricultural lobby pretty much got what it wanted, which is to keep things pretty much as they are, with a little bit of greening around the fringes. But it's disappointing. And really what we needed was a much more a way of shifting subsidies from, you know, mainstream agricultural commodity production in towards new sustainable initiatives. And in that respect, given the way it's framed, it's going to be much more difficult to find money that would enable smaller farmers to make those conversion processes, you know. And as Finola says, I mean, if you've been in dairy all your life, how are you suddenly going to start kind of switching to growing, you know, to horticulture? I mean, you don't have the expertise, you don't have the equipment. It's very, very difficult. But this is where I think land leasing is a really critical question, because, you know, we have a very aging farm population in terms of the demographics are very clear. The average age of farmers is well over 60. and you know, and young people have been basically exiting the sector. Nobody wants to take over the family farm anymore, compared to, you know, having a white collar job in Dublin. So in some ways the question is, but there are people who would be, but they're not, they haven't inherited land. So we have to find ways of doing that. And in the United States, there have been some very innovative mechanisms by which people have been able to secure some kind of lease on land, you know, under the kind of, you know, supports of the landowner. But of course, we've got this, you know, there is a problem with land owning and, you know, the willingness to let go of anything. But that's really an area for possibility. And the only other thing I'd say to that, of course, just in response to James, his question about having, you know, estates producing food. I mean, that's going down the route of thinking about vertical farms, you know, growing perhaps in organized structures, you know, in either their freight containers, which has become popular, or, you know, sort of, you know, using old factory buildings, for example. And Finola might have some thoughts about this in relation to the quality of food, but, you know, large scale microgreens and that kind of thing can be grown in those kinds of estates, but you're never really going to get into anything of significant volume really outside, you know, I suppose, high value produce. But that's an option, you see. I mean, that's the point, is that we need to keep all of these options on the table so that you've got food producing estates on the edge of in the suburbs. You've got, you know, converted farms growing horticulture, you know, further out. I mean, that's how agricultural land use was always organized in relation to distance from the city. And that's what we got to find ways of recovering.
Thanks for that. And just to say that John McSweeney raises the very pertinent question around food waste and you know, how that can be addressed. And maybe that could be the subject of another discussion in the future. And Keelan Tobin, thank you, who works in this area in MTU. Has put up there just a local project called the Cork Urban Soil Project. That's a small project that's recently received some national funding to grow it to a larger scale around managing food waste. So thank you very much. And thank you also, James, for reminding us that the public consultation for the Irish Government CAP strategic plan is open for comment until the 8th of December. And he's put a link up for that. And Ellie O'Donovan, lovely to see you, Ellie. Food Talks and Gap International are working with caterers to help provide healthier and more environmentally aware choices for their guests. And that's a link there as well. I have 1 minute to say thank you very much to everybody. Thank you, Colin, for joining us all the way from, I hope, sunny Portugal, because it's certainly not sunny Cork. Sunny Portugal. We can see the sun shining in on your face there. We're not a bit jealous. Thank you very much for joining us this morning or this afternoon. It's been wonderful to have you with us. Finola, thank you for your fantastic work here in Cork City. Yourself and Maria Young are doing tremendous work across the city. And we were delighted to hear from you as well. Just a reminder, a third plug for the Clashdove Community Garden on Saturday. Volunteers badly needed. We'd love to see people there on Saturday with wheelbarrows and shovels. If you have them, bring them along to help lay out that new community garden, which is really coming back and bringing it back to its former glory. So we'd love to see people there. Thanks everyone for your participation. It was lovely to see so many positive comments and questions. This is being recorded. I think somebody's asking there as I speak. It will be on the Cork Healthy Cities Greening Our City website. I can send the link to everybody afterwards. It'll be up in the next day or two. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you in the new year. I can't believe I'm about to say this, but happy Christmas to everyone. And I look forward to seeing you all in January.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.